My name's Dr. Sarah Steele. I'm the Deputy Director of the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College, Cambridge, which you can see behind me, even though we're not currently in because we are still on some social distancing requirements here. I'm also a senior researcher in Cambridge Public Health, which is part of the University of Cambridge's clinical school. And I'm delighted to welcome today Adam, Dilan, and Peter, who all represent some different organisations, which we will introduce in the coming moments. Up front, I just want to say to you that we are recording today and it will be uploaded for YouTube for you to share after the event. You can follow us for the link from YouTube on @IntelForum, or you can follow Peter, whose Twitter is @PeterASinger, or you can follow the @GHS_network, which is the Global Health Security Network, all of which will tweet the link to the event recording after we have uploaded it. But I just want to give you a brief introduction to all of those who are here today. And the first is to say the Intellectual Forum, where I'm from, was set up 4 years ago to get people thinking and talking about the important issues of today, and to really reach outside the boundaries of our own college. We've welcomed amazing global speakers from all different places around the world. We've had Helen Clark come previously and talk to us about other organizations within the UN. We've had various different people from around the world, and we've also been able to showcase the fantastic work that our own academics have done. Of course, as I've said, this recording will go onto our YouTube, but you'll find those past event recordings there as well, and we'd love you to catch up on them. I also want to take this opportunity to mention the University of Cambridge's ThinkLab, which is also co-hosting this with us, but unfortunately haven't been able to join us today. And the University of Cambridge ThinkLab, which is managed by Tyler Shores, is a new interdisciplinary project that seeks to research and connect it together with real-world impact. So the focus there is on how the pandemic is changing how we work and how we live. And they too have a number of projects and events you might find interesting. But today, of course, we are working with ANU's College of Law, where global health law and governance and health law feature in various different degrees across the college. And we also have prominent legal experts like Professor Don Rothwell and Emeritus Professor Kim Rubenstein, who've figured prominently in the recent controversy in Australia over India's travel ban. So the travel ban Australia has with India. But we're also really pleased to welcome Adam, who is here to represent the Global Health Security Network, a new multidisciplinary professional association that's dedicated to facilitating evidence-informed policy for the detection, prevention, and control of infectious disease threats, irrespective of their origin or source. Following the inaugural Global Health Security Conference in Sydney in 2019, the network was established with a view to create a space for global health academics, scientists, and policymakers from multiple sectors around the world to have a platform to share their thoughts and ideas. Of course, with so many professionals in the field joining us today, as well as students, as well as all different people from all different walks of life interested in this, we're super excited to have you. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, etc. throughout. There is a Q&A function down below on the screen, if that's where you've set it up, but have a look around. Peter will talk for a little while and absolutely give us great insight, but he really welcomes your questions. So please use that Q&A function throughout, but also please feel free to use Twitter throughout to communicate with all of us. We, as I mentioned, have @IntelForum, @PeterASinger, and @GHS_network. There's other Twitter handles. You'll see it on our page pop up if you're watching the Twitter feed right now. We really welcome you to interact throughout this event. And I'm going to hand over now to Dilan to introduce the issue and then Adam to introduce Peter more fully. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. Vaccine equity is one of the most significant public policy challenges of our time. This is a multifaceted, multidisciplinary public policy problem. It's one the international community really needs to solve. And it's one in which I think the legitimacy of the international community and international law in particular, if I can speak as a lawyer, is very much under question. I think it was very heartening to see the United States step in and to support an IP waiver. Everyone has a right to health, and it's important that we should realise that as much as we can. The problem is, I suppose, the vaccine supplies are limited, and wealth, in particularly wealth for wealthy nations, distorts the market somewhat and could lead to a lengthening of the pandemic, and that is certainly a very significant concern. So I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Singer's thoughts on the matter, and I'll hand over to Adam to introduce Dr. Singer. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dylan. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Peter Singer. Dr. Singer is Special Advisor to the WHO Director General, Dr. Ghebreyesus, and an Assistant Director General of the WHO. Prior to his current role, Dr. Singer has had a truly impressive career with serving as Chief Executive Officer of the highly successful Grand Challenges Canada, Sun Life Financial Chair and Director of the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics. And Dr. Singer is also Professor of Medicine at University of Toronto. He's published over 300 articles. He's been awarded several awards and is an Officer of the Order of Canada. He's received over $50 million in research grants and has mentored hundreds of students, I'm sure who all view him very warmly. Dr. Singer chaired the transition team. He's been intimately involved in establishing initiatives while employed in the WHO, including the current strategy around the triple billion target, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. In his current role, he's very much focused on the impact of impact at the country level. I would be able to talk at some length about Dr. Singer's work, but for the purposes of time, you're not really here to listen to me. I'd rather us actually hand over to the person we've all come to listen to. So Peter, over to you, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Adam and Sarah, Dylan, and really very grateful to Jesus College, Cambridge, and the Intellectual Forum, ANU, the Global Health Security Network, Cambridge Public Health, and the ThinkLab for inviting me to speak with you today. It's actually very humbling to be with you. As Sarah said, please feel free to tweet during this presentation. I just want to start by saying that what we are all living through together is definitely the worst global public health crisis in 100 years, and arguably the worst global crisis in our lifetimes. More than 155 million cases have been reported. Sadly, 3.2 million deaths have been reported. And the rates of COVID globally have been increasing for 9 or 10 weeks now. There is, of course, hope, and that's where I will focus as we come to the end of these brief remarks. And also just to say that that I will also be focusing on young people, because I imagine there are a number of students listening. And right up front, I want to say to you that your engagement in this very, very significant issue really, really matters. You know, one of the key lessons of the pandemic has been the importance of equity. In fact, I like to say that the top 3 lessons of the pandemic are equity, equity, and equity. That includes the pre-existing social and economic inequities where the pandemic has shone a very, very harsh light. Those communities where, for example, you would have much higher rates of COVID and much lower rates of vaccination in, for example, communities, postal codes, geographic communities that are highly racialized, for example. So really, it's disclosed and shone a very harsh light on the pre-existing social and economic inequities, which the purpose of which is actually to be able to redress as we move towards ending the pandemic and the recovery. And the issue of this year of 2021 is vaccine equity. Really, to put it more bluntly, vaccine inequity, because that is a key pathway, a key exit strategy for ending the pandemic. What I want to say is that it has to come as a 1-2 punch with the public health measures. And I want to remind everyone that at the present time, it's extremely important to keep masking, to continue with physical distance, to be outdoors as much as possible, open the windows, and wash your hands. So with that, what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes or so is what is vaccine equity, why is it important, and how should we address it? And then I'm going to end with some comments again to young people. So what is vaccine equity? About 1.2 billion doses of COVID vaccines have been administered around the world. And let me just say that it's an amazing accomplishment that we have multiple vaccines that have been licensed and are being administered. You know, when I went to medical school, the teaching, and even until last year, year before, if you'd asked me how many years would it take to develop a vaccine, I would have said 10. Actually, it's incredible, the pipeline of vaccines, and especially the vaccines that have been at least received emergency use listing. It's incredible that that happened within 1 year. First day WHO heard of the pandemic was on December 31st, 2019. And the first emergency use listing of a COVID vaccine was on December 31st, 2020. Exactly 1 year. Absolutely amazing. But the sad side of that story is that the 1.2 billion doses that have been administered around the world have been administered extremely inequitably. More than 80% of those doses have gone to high income and upper middle income countries. And to put that another way, if you look at the doses per 100 population across different strata of countries, and this is data from pandem/ic.com, which is a really great site to look at vaccine equity. In high income countries, the doses per 100 of population is 45.2%. In upper middle income countries, 15.8%. In lower middle income countries, 6.9%. And in low income countries, 0.5%. To put that another way, if you look at country by country, the let's say number of people who've received at least one dose of COVID vaccine. In many countries, like for example, the United Kingdom, more than 50% of people have received at least one dose of the vaccine. In low income countries, however, that number is less than 1%. So 1 in 2 versus 1 less than 1 in 100. That is the snapshot of vaccine inequity. Why is vaccine inequity a problem? It's a problem for at least 4 reasons. Firstly, it's a problem in epidemiology, because while the virus is raging anywhere in the world, while the fire is burning in any country, and our thoughts are very much with the people of India at this time, while the fire is raging anywhere in the world, it's casting off embers that can go anywhere. And those embers are often in the form of variants. And so for epidemiological reasons, if you want to put out the fire at home, you have to take the fight to where the virus is and put out the fire everywhere in the world. So the generation of variants is the epidemiological reason. It's also a problem for ethical reasons. And I really like what Dilan, who's on this call, Dilan Thampapillai, tweeted a little while ago, and I'm going to quote him. He said, quote, "If the international community fails people in poorer countries around the world in 2021 on the issue of vaccine equity, it will have profound implications for justice, decency, and human rights." And I fully agree with Dilan. and ethics. And it really comes down to whether we value the dignity and worth of every human being as of equal value around the world. Ethics is another very strong reason why vaccine inequity is a bad thing. So epidemiology, ethics, but also economics. Some estimates have been that the hit to the world economy from COVID is in the trillions of dollars, upwards of 9 trillion in one estimate. And so the only way to restart nationally or internationally the world economy or national economies, the only way to solve the economic problem is to solve the public health problem. And then finally, the pandemic has really strained at times peace and security around the world. And so I see this not only as an issue in epidemiology, as an issue in ethics, as an issue in economics, but also as an issue in national and global security. So having talked about what is vaccine inequity and why it's bad, let me now turn to how we might together redress it. And here I want you to think about the 3 Ds, the 3 Ds being dollars, doses, and domestic manufacturing. Let's start first with dollars. The international structure that has been set up essentially to redistribute doses equitably, both to accelerate the development of vaccines and to equitably distribute them, is called COVAX. It's led by WHO, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, CEPI, and UNICEF. And it has a shortfall for this year of $19 billion and for this year and next year of $60 billion. You might have seen recently that former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown has called upon the G7 to essentially, in a burden sharing manner, the G7, the G20, and other countries in a burden sharing manner to fully fund COVAX. And that would be an extremely good idea. I want you to think about that $60 billion in comparison to tens of trillions of dollars of economic damage and stimulus spending. It's actually probably one of the best value for money deals there is in terms of investing in health at the moment. So dollars are scarce, and dollars is a way to redress the vaccine inequities. Secondly, doses. It's not enough to have dollars if you can't translate them into vaccine doses. So the COVAX facility that I mentioned earlier has distributed, let's say, about 50 million doses so far of its planned 2 billion doses that it plans to redistribute or distribute by the end of 2021. The limiting factor there is actually the availability of the vaccine and the bilateral distribution by some countries and the domestic use that's led to those inequities. And while of course we celebrate every single person who's vaccinated, those inequities are there, and they're bad for the reasons that I discussed. So, in terms of these doses, and the 50 million doses, WHO and its Director General has called upon countries to donate those doses to COVAX so they can be equitably distributed in a multilateral way around the world. And some countries have started to do that. For example, France, Sweden, Norway, and we hope that others will follow. So how do we redress vaccine inequity? By closing the $60 billion gap, $19 billion this year for COVAX, by redistributing doses, as some countries have started to do through COVAX, a multilateral mechanism. And I would say very, very significantly by focusing on domestic manufacturing. Domestic manufacturing, which could be at the regional level, which could be in high income or low income countries. Another word for this is local production, is really the pathway to self-reliance. It is what creates jobs. It is what creates regional security of the availability of vaccine, ultimately. And so in the midterm, this is a transformative strategy for global health. This week, we celebrate the announcement by the United States to temporarily waive to support the initiative of India and South Africa for the temporary waiving of intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization on COVID technologies, COVID vaccines, depending on which particular initiative you're referring to. And this is a good thing because, and the WHO has said, and Dr. Tedros has said, that he hopes other countries follow suit in terms of the Indian and South African initiative. This is still in play, but we do see the decision of the United States as really a historic decision, and it will help to pave the path towards vaccine equity. What's needed in addition to the temporary suspension of intellectual property is technology transfer. And the WHO, for example, has launched a technology transfer hub for mRNA vaccines and is taking applications both from people who want to share their technology and know-how and companies with production capacity that wish to manufacture vaccines. And so this whole area of domestic manufacturing, I spent a disproportionate amount of time on it because I do think that it is the one that helps to transform the model. In the short term, there's no question that what's most important is the dose sharing, because that's what's going to be needed in the next 3 months, 6 months to save the lives of people around the world, because we are beginning to see evidence that highly vaccinated populations have dropping cases, are better protected, and so on. So that's what's important in the short term, but we can do both things at once. So how do we address these inequities? Dollars, doses, and domestic manufacturing. I'd like to now ask for anyone who has questions to start to put them in the Q&A box as I start to wrap up, because what I really hope to do is engage with you on these issues. And I want you to think about my comments as the type of appetizer for the meal, and very much look forward to engaging with you on your questions. Now, in wrapping up, what I'd like to say is we covered really 3 questions. What is vaccine inequity? The 1 in 2, let's say, or the 1 in 3 in high income countries versus the less than 1 in 100 in low income countries. Why is it important? For reasons of epidemiology and variant generation, for reasons of ethics, for reasons of economics, and I would argue for reasons of peace and security. How do we redress these vaccine inequities? Through dollars, through doses sharing, and through domestic manufacturing. And in wrapping up, what I'd like to focus on is the following. What I'd like to put forward for your consideration is that vaccine inequity is the world's Mandela moment. Nelson Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." I think we should pick up this problem as a moonshot, as an incredibly important collective global ambition, and then ask ourselves in a realistic way what it will take to get the job done by a particular point in time. This is our Mandela moment. And the Mandela moment requires leadership, which is, in a sense, the ultimate vaccine to address the pandemic, but also the interlinked global challenges we face in racism, in economic inequality, and in climate. So leadership is the ultimate vaccine. And that's not just leadership at the highest levels of government, it is, but it's leadership right down to communities and right down to young people. It's leadership right across the board. I'll just note that if you go to Our World in Data, which has been a terrific data resource, and you look at the cumulative mortality through the pandemic, even in G20 countries, there's more than a 50-fold difference. And that's not explained by, for example, IHR capacity alone. Necessary, but not sufficient. So leadership, and especially the dynamic decision-making, is really a very, very important piece of the puzzle. And I'm very proud to work with someone who I consider to be a superb leader, my friend and colleague, Dr. Tedros, who I think has really defined Hemingway's phrase, or is the definition of Hemingway's phrase, guts is grace under pressure. You know, I mentioned equity, vaccine equity, and the pre-existing social inequities. What I want to say to young people is that equity is in your hands. Equity is in your hands. What gives me hope, and I think there's a tremendous amount of hope now of ending this pandemic. What gives me hope is young people. And my advice to young people is top line, find a problem and solve it. Look around you, see where you see inequities and see what you can do to solve them. And after this, I'll tweet the full list of kind of advice to young people, but I just want to highlight that, equity is in your hands. Now, there's hope that the pandemic will end, but in many parts of the world, it's no question that populations are experiencing the darkness before the dawn, and our thoughts are with them. And the 1-2 punch of vaccination or COVID tools generally, along with the oxygen, the dexamethasone, the diagnostics, the PPE, is extremely important, plus public health measures, being outdoors, masking, physical distancing, opening the windows, etc. And where I want to end is on this. What I want to put to you, and this relates to the point I was making about the Mandela moment, is what this pandemic has done. What this pandemic is, most fundamentally, is an X-ray of our soul. Character really matters. Kindness really matters. And to those young people especially, and to everyone who suffered so much during this pandemic, I want to leave us with that lesson, because it does offer an opportunity for each of us to think about our own leadership, our own character, our own kindness, and our own relationships with everyone around us, and what we each will do to make our neighborhood, our countries, and the world a more equitable place as we recover from this terrible, terrible pandemic. And hope is here, recovery is coming, and that is where I would suggest that we might reflect. And with that, Sarah and Adam and Dylan, I want to thank you again very much for inviting me. It's really been an incredible pleasure to address folks, and I hope we've got a lot of questions and we can use the time to address them. So thank you so much, and really look forward to engaging with you on your questions.
Thanks so much for that, Peter. We have a lot of questions coming in. I'll begin with one that directly takes from what you've just said. It's from Herbert Huppert, who is actually a mathematician here at the University of Cambridge, who's mentioned a quite important point around leadership. You've kind of talked about the capacity to pick up leadership at an individual level and for our students to pick that up. But he noticed that your whole talk and attitude is based on the idea that there is a desire towards equality between people, and that he's observed that in certain settings, certainly people and politicians do seem to disagree with that. How can you convince them otherwise? How can you convince people to subscribe to this kind of equitable ethos?
I think it goes back to young people and domestic populations generally. most governments want to do the right thing, and they need the support of their populations to do it. Take the issue of vaccine sharing. It's very hard to do that when you're working to protect your domestic population. But we do have certain traditions, for example, tithing in the Judeo-Christian tradition, zakat in the Muslim tradition, that really do resonate with contemporaneous sharing. And that will be implemented if young people especially call upon their governments to share vaccines. And that actually is what's necessary. So in many political systems, that's really the way forward. And then beyond that, of course, there's a discussion of the different nature of political systems around the world. But what I would say about that is that when you look at the cumulative mortality, it doesn't easily reflect one or the other type of political system. And so, to your colleague there from Cambridge, I would say, yes, it's about our leaders, but it's also about us. And it's what we say to our leaders in terms of what we want, generally speaking.
So to follow that up, there's a question that's kind of somewhat linked to what you've just said, which is about assuring and supporting distribution processes within countries. Somebody here has observed that there's, of course, inequity within nations that's really pertinent and important to pay attention to. And so there is a question here about any plans, strategies, advice around in-country issues, having paid so much attention to international obligations in your talk so far.
Yes, this is so important, and every country will have better or worse examples. For example, we had a stocktake this week at the World Health Organization on PHC and equity in the context of the pandemic and WHO's mission on the triple billion. And it started with a short case study from Dr. Kwame McKenzie at the Wellesley Institute in Toronto. And he's recently published in The Lancet on this. We'll be tweeting his video shortly. And this was really the story of the Black community in Toronto. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the early data was showing actually what I said before, which is that certain geographies had a very high incidence, racialized communities had the highest incidence of disease, the highest incidence of hospitalization, and the lower incidences of vaccination. And those racialized communities, led by community groups, worked with city officials to begin to develop, to collect disaggregated data initially, and then to use that data to redress inequities by targeting with public health measures initially, and then later with vaccination, certain communities, certain hotspots. And so here's a very good example of a within country inequity, this one in an urban setting, where the community came together and through community leadership and through community groups began to redress the inequities. You also see this in Indigenous communities. For example, again, I'll use a Canadian example. You see Indigenous physicians working with Indigenous community leaders to build trust to vaccinate Indigenous communities. Because, let me just take a sidebar here, Sarah, to say people talk about this term vaccine hesitancy. It's actually not all hesitancy. It's not a problem of information. It's often a problem of trust. And it needs to be seen in the historical context, often of the exploitation of the communities that have vaccine hesitancy by the people that are now offering them the vaccine. So the within countries inequities is extremely important. There's a couple of concrete examples and a couple of ideas on how to begin to redress them. And I think the sharing of these good practices and case studies is a very important piece of the puzzle.
Somebody else has kind of capitalized on that in one of their questions for you, which is that, and they've commented, some studies have shown that achieving herd immunity through vaccination may be impossible because of things like unequal vaccine rollout, variants, etc., but also things like that lack of trust. What are your thoughts on this? Is focusing on vaccination and thus vaccine equity a real solution to the pandemic that we are facing?
Yes. And the real world data comes from countries that have done it. there's always this theoretical debate about whether vaccination merely prevents bad things from happening to you, death and so on, and it does, or whether it also helps to reduce the rates of transmission. And the real world data from countries, from Israel, from the UK, from subnational jurisdictions, shows a gap, and some of the good work here has been in the FT, where you see that the communities that are the age strata often that have greater rates of vaccination have lower rates of cases, hospitalization, deaths, etc. So vaccines are definitely protective. What the end game looks like is still not completely clear. Variants, there is a race between vaccines and variants, which is why it's so important to take the fight to the virus wherever it is around the world. But so far, there is no variant that has escaped, if you will, from vaccination. And so vaccines are an extremely important exit strategy here. Having said that, my colleagues at WHO, and I agree with them, and I've tried to emphasize it a couple of times in the talk, point out that it's not a silver bullet. There are other scientific tools. If you have COVID, what matters to you is not a vaccine, but oxygen and dexamethasone and testing. So it needs to be done in combination with scientific tools and extremely importantly, the public health measures, because that's the 1-2 punch. And please don't forget the public health measures, because vaccination is not a silver bullet. As we put it here, it's vaccines and.
And so we've got a question around that in terms of how we can improve vaccines, and specifically picking up on your point around intellectual property rights. So there's a question here about how we can ensure adequate and timely funding for R&D with reasonable profit margins, continuing to support and motivate the private sector while ensuring the rapid scale up of production and equal distribution of the most effective and safe vaccines. So the kind of question there is, how do we do that? How do we kind of address that profit motive at the same time as we kind of ensure rapid upscaling? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a few. Thank you. It's a very good question, and I'm not going to pretend to give the answer to that question, because it's a very complicated question as well. But I do have a few thoughts to share. One is that this is a once in 100-year problem. So this isn't business as usual, which leads me to the discussion of the Mandela moment, the historic nature of the US decision, for example. So that context really matters. Secondly, much of this R&D is substantially publicly funded already, and that really needs to be fully incorporated. Thirdly, the getting up and running of, for example, an mRNA platform may not take as much time as one would think. As this is the first RNA vaccine that's ever been licensed, or these are the first RNA vaccines that have ever been licensed, the ones for COVID. And so within a year, those platforms were up and running. And presumably it would be a little bit shorter next time. So that gives you a sense that it's not impossible and it's not an unending timeline. And finally, nobody's arguing that the inventors and the companies shouldn't be compensated. They should. The question, though, is how we optimize production, because the bottleneck here at this moment is production. It's a once in 100-year crisis, and I think we all need to do everything we can to solve that crisis. The longer term balance between those incentives, the need for innovation, which is so important. I used to run a foundation that funded innovation. I'm a full believer in innovation, is an extremely important balance to strike that we'll need to all really reflect upon and find common cause. But for the time being, we have a once in 100-year crisis to solve, and we have to solve that together.
So one of the questions that kind of follows on from that is about that increased capacity. I'm actually going to collapse a few of the questions. I know there's a lot of questions coming in, so I just want to be clear to people. Do keep using the Q&A box. I will try and collapse some of these in together to make sure Peter covers as much as he can, but I'm sure, Peter, you're happy to continue this conversation on Twitter and other places afterwards. So I just want to say, shoot those questions down below and I will be collapsing some together. In that mode, one of the things that has followed on from what you're saying is about how we actually increase that rate of production. A few of the questions go to patent release and manufacturing vaccines in developing settings. But a number of questions have picked up on the fact that actually that's great to release that capacity, but they need to have the actual in-country ability to manufacture and distribute, which the infrastructure at a local level isn't presently capable of doing. So some people wanted to kind of discuss both the intellectual property aspects of it, but also couple that with what that means at a practical level and how we can support that. Could you comment on those?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So first thing to say is talent is global, opportunity isn't. In Grand Challenges Canada, we supported mostly innovators in low and middle income countries. And we found incredible talent and opportunity. So probably there's more capacity than you think. That's the first point. The second point is that obviously concrete measures are needed. And that's why something like the WHO mRNA Technology Transfer Hub is very important. And parts of these initiatives, including the initiatives by the AU and the African CDC, undoubtedly have to do with capacity building, talent, because that's critical in any innovation and biomanufacturing system. So that's point two. And by the way, that Technology Transfer Hub is based on a successful experience between 2006 and 2016 that WHO had in terms of technology transfer at a hub for influenza vaccines. So it can be done, and it can build capacity and talent. And by the way, the best way is to build capacity is through problem solving. Then the third point I want to make, and part of the reason I emphasize this model, in addition to the self-reliance and the security aspects of the local production, domestic manufacturing production, whatever you'd like to refer it as, often at the regional level, is it really challenges our model of development. So, you know, there are countries, high-income countries, Canada is one of them. The UK was maybe one of them before the pandemic, that have let their own domestic biomanufacturing of vaccines, let's just say, move into a less than robust state. And at the same time, you've got whole regions like the African region, which manufactures only 1% of the vaccines that it uses at the moment, but also have no domestic manufacturing. And when we talk about it in a high income country, we talk about it as economic development and innovation. And when we talk about it in a lower income region, we talk about it as international development. Well, I'm sorry, those two things are the same thing. And we should think about them as the same thing. And whether what you want to take out of this in terms of the capacity building nature of your question is triangular development or what have you, we really need to see this as equivalent. And just like talent is important in any high income country, talent is important in a low income country. And just like procurement is important in a high income country, procurement is important in a, so let's see this in a, let's say more balanced way, because I'm sorry, it's the same thing.
So we had a question that kind of played that down to a more granular level, where there was a question about basically creating bottlenecks based on ingredients that were necessary for vaccine manufacture. There was a view that somebody has kind of set out here that while we might de-patent COVID vaccines, allowing different countries with different income bases to produce vaccines domestically, that there have been some concerns that manufacture would create some supply chain issues around the ingredients that are necessary for these, disrupting global supply chains, and where ultimately some analysis suggests that high income countries would win out. Do you think that's a valid concern, or do you think that that's something that we can address?
The focus on bottlenecks is a valid concern, and it's really very important. So it's a practical matter. On domestic manufacturing, you have technology transfer, you have talent, procurement, you have intellectual property, you have all these elements that are bottlenecks. And what I think we should be doing is actually what the African Union and several African presidents are doing, which is to say, you know what, it's time for us to do vaccine manufacturing. For example, President Kagame has said this in Rwanda. and President Ramaphosa in South Africa. It's time for us to do this, and we're going to do it. And so I think going down that road, identifying and addressing bottlenecks as they come along, is a very, very valid way to proceed, identifying and overcoming bottlenecks. What I don't necessarily think is valid is to say, okay, well, we're going to leave the status quo. All that manufacturing is only going to be in high-income countries. And, you know, the whole African region is going to forever be dependent on importing vaccines. That's less valid. And to those people that say we need to save a lot of lives in the next 3 to 6 months, I say I completely agree, which is why we need to dual track the dose sharing through COVAX and the initiatives to develop domestic manufacturing. And these initiatives are being led by national governments and regional political groupings. And so it's not really up to us to say what they should be doing anyway. And they're doing it, and I think it's a terrific thing.
And so somebody has asked here is, what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of COVAX? And there's related questions to that where people have asked about what lessons we're learning and what we should do in future pandemics about distribution.
I'm a huge fan of COVAX. Firstly, it really did help to accelerate the production of that pipeline of more than 200 vaccine candidates, the many in stage 3 trials now, and several vaccines that have received emergency use listing or licensure by competent domestic regulatory authorities. So it succeeded, I think, in its goal of accelerating through common procurement mechanisms. And I think it's also a great model for equitable distribution and engaging the governance of the World Health Assembly, 194 member states, in terms of determining the nature of that equitable allocation. So I'm a big fan of COVAX. Now, COVAX can only distribute the vaccines that it has. So it can be the best acceleration and equitable distribution mechanism in the world. And I think it is precedent setting in that regard, including in the collaboration among the multilateral agencies. But it can't distribute vaccines it doesn't have. And that leads us then to the good models of countries like France, for example, that have agreed, Sweden, that have agreed to share vaccines, and the importance of ramping up production, which happens not only through the kind of midterm domestic manufacturing around the world that we discussed in some detail, Sarah, but will also happen naturally by more vaccines coming online. So for example, this week, COVAX did an agreement with Novavax. Novavax is a new vaccine that is not yet in use, but shortly in terms of regulatory authorization, at least by WHO, but shortly will be, potentially. So there's an example of even that momentum in the pipeline will help increase supply. And it's fantastic that there's a mechanism like COVAX based on a principle of solidarity to be distributing the vaccines that we do have. So I turn that question around and I say it's a great mechanism for accelerating innovation. It's a great mechanism. And by the way, more generally, the ACT accelerator, diagnostics, drugs, oxygen, and PPE. It's a great mechanism for equitable redistribution or equitable distribution around the world. It's gone to more than 100 countries, those 50 million or so doses of vaccine. And many of those countries would not have any vaccine or much vaccine, not have any vaccine at the moment, and they've initiated. But it can only distribute the vaccines that it has. And that leads us to the importance of that second D on dose sharing. And doing it in an equitable way through a multilateral mechanism like COVAX.
So one of the things that a number of people have picked up on, of course, as part of that dose sharing and as part of some of the discussions that we've had around intellectual property, is that the US has supported an IP waiver on vaccines. We've had a number of questions, and I'm collapsing these again, about what that means for other countries needing to change their position, We've had a few questions that have gone to the heart of intellectual property in the future. You're going to have to forgive my French here a little bit because I have not done French since high school. I'm reading somebody's question in French, but what that means for the future fabrication of vaccines and the procedures there. So we've had a number of different questions about the sort of what this US decision means going forward, how we can capitalize on it, and what that means for our future positions and our approaches to intellectual property.
So the US decision is historic. Dr. Tedros has commended the Biden administration for that decision. There's obviously an active negotiation underway at the World Trade Organization on this very issue. There's an active map. It's a little hard with the virtual background, but you can find this, there it is, active map of who opposes and who doesn't and who's undecided about this. But again, it's the same question. It's like the first question that you were asked, Sarah, that you asked about leadership and governmental leadership. Governments do what their people want at the end of the day, in most cases. And so if you're on this call and you believe in vaccine sharing, if you're on this call and you believe that the sharing of intellectual property, which is an important piece of the puzzle, paving the way for vaccine equity, but as we've discussed, not the only piece of the puzzle. If you believe in those things, then call upon your governments to do those things. WHO's position is certainly in favor of vaccine sharing, dose sharing with COVAX, and it's certainly encouraging other countries to follow the lead of India, South Africa, and now the United States and other countries in terms of the temporary suspension of intellectual property rights in this once in a century crisis.
So one of the interesting questions, which I'm not sure we're going to be able to cover right now, but will be an interesting, I think, future debate point, is about how we could perhaps move away from the patent model in relation to public health matters, and how we could reconceive or think of an alternative model of rewarding innovation. Do you have any ideas on what that model could be, or any thoughts on that kind of comment?
Yeah, it's a fantastic comment. And all I would say is let's rethink our assumptions, because our assumptions haven't worked to vaccinate everybody in an equitable way. And that's the point of this seminar. And so in terms of how people can get engaged and how people can follow this issue as it evolves and contribute to it, what I'd highlight is later today, actually, the WHO press conference is, and kudos to my colleagues, Dr. Tedros, who's met the world media twice, 3 times a week since the beginning of this crisis, more than 150 times. Later today, the focus is on the new Economic Council of WHO that's chaired by Dr. Mariana Mazzucato. That council, by the way, is all women, which I think is a terrific precedent setting thing. And their focus, no doubt, will also involve this question. Based on the work that Dr. Mazzucato has done on innovation and public funding of innovation. Where that balance will fall out, what that model will look like, I can't answer today, but I think that that Economic Council no doubt will be exploring this question, and it would be great if people on this call engaged in that discussion as well. We can do it later today. I mean, it's such a concrete and actionable thing. And I think it will be important to settle this question. But in the first instance, what's important is to get everybody who wants a vaccine in the world, out of the 7.8 billion people in the world, vaccinated as soon as possible, because job one has to be the end of the pandemic, because that's the only way we can come back to some semblance of our normal lives.
And so there's a few questions that follow on from that about structural changes to address inequalities, some voluntary state action, and what do we need to do in the future to kind of address these issues. And then one that I just want to follow up that kind of couples with that nicely, which is the top priorities for the WHO going forward. Could you kind of comment on the future? So I'm kind of asking you that in terms of what do you think the top priorities should be for the WHO over the coming 5 years?
Well, the immediate top priority is to end the pandemic. And we've done everything possible, everything we can, working around the world and around the clock since we first heard of the virus to battle the pandemic and end the pandemic. And that has to be the top priority for all of us. Beyond that, it's going to be necessary for the world to recover. You know, we were off track on the Sustainable Development Goals, which all countries agreed to in 2015 for 2030 targets. There's about 50 health-related Sustainable Development Goals, which, by the way, in our strategy, that's what the triple billion target is. It's an agglomeration of those 50 health-related development goals into three things that you can remember: universal health coverage, healthier populations, and protection against health emergencies. We're way off track. So in the recovery, we need to have an equitable recovery, a resilient recovery to prepare against future and prevent future pandemics, and an equitable and resilient recovery that I think will, to a large extent, will be powered by primary health care. So there is ending the pandemic, there is the recovery, and there's the future focus on pandemic preparedness, which is very much the focus of the pandemic treaty that will be discussed, is likely to be discussed at the World Health Assembly that's coming up. But I want to bring it back, Sarah, to the individuals listening here. I mentioned the advice to young people. I mentioned that the top line advice was find a problem and solve it. You know, another bit of that advice is acknowledge your own privilege and lean out, because representation matters. So when you're talking about inequity more broadly, I talked about the importance of Indigenous physicians. I talked about the importance of Black community leaders or leaders in the Black community in the examples. It's very important for us to really think about how we've each individually thought about equity, thought about our own privilege, to lean out, and whether it's gender equality, whether it's BIPOC equality, I think that's one of the things that young people should really think about. All of us should really think about, actually, maybe more so older people than younger people, and think about very carefully what we're each individually going to do in our leadership to redress the inequities that have been so harshly exposed by the pandemic. So that's the key priority for WHO, is ending the pandemic, helping countries recover, helping the world recover, and making sure this never happens again. And we all have a lot to learn, but I want to bring it down to the individual level, because this pandemic has been an X-ray of our souls. Equity is in your hands. Character really matters.
Thanks so much for that, Peter. I know we didn't get to all of the questions that were asked. Our wonderful team are exporting them so that we can look at answering some of those and posing them on Twitter afterwards in an appropriate way. So if your question hasn't been asked, don't panic, don't worry, there is an opportunity. Peter, thank you so much for that reflection. I think it's, as somebody who works on the social determinants of health and is currently looking at children's meals in some of my research, can really speak to the fact that having children's voices has enriched what I do. And that leadership that involves a holistic view, not just a top-down view, is just so critical. So that reflection has really struck home for me. And thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Just invite Adam and Dilan to come back. We've had lots of thanks in the questions and answers as well, just so that you know, lots of people being very appreciative and from all around the world. I don't know if Dilan and Adam noticed this, but that we had people who were coming in from Canada and North America, from Africa. We've had a few people comment from here in Cambridge. We've had a load of people from the Asia Pacific region. There's been people who have commented and already sent their thanks. So we just want to extend that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to kind of looking towards the future and to hearing more from you, from the WHO, and hopefully to achieving this kind of more equitable world for health and well-being for everybody, wherever they may be.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And what I would say to you is that the social determinants matter, because it's not a big step from vaccine equity to paid sick leave, for example. What I would say to Adam is to thank him for the honest feedback that he's given to WHO, which reflects the character aspects that I've mentioned, because honesty, by the way, also one of my bits of advice on leadership for the young people. And I want to thank Dilan for his advocacy of justice and human rights, as was so obvious in that quote that I read. So look, we often say we're all in this together. We are all in this together, and there's a concrete example of how the faces that you see on the screen are all in this together, and we're deeply appreciative at the World Health Organization. And I know Dr. Tedros is deeply appreciative for all the engagement, all the support of communities of young people from right around the world to end this pandemic and then help the world recover and redress the inequities that have been exposed. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.